Well, good morning, and thank you very much for the invitation to be here today and for providing the facilities for us to be here at this really important meeting. By way of introduction, I'm Vernon Rapley. I'm the Director of Cultural Heritage Protection and Security at the Victoria and Albert Museum in London. I'm also the ICOM Chair for the International Committee of Museum Security. Professor Peterson, spoke earlier about the three essential sectors of cultural protection coming together and being essential for successful cultural protection practices. Before joining the Victoria and Albert Museum, and I've now been there for 13 years in the heritage sector, I was the head of Scotland Yard's Art and Antiques unit, so I was a police officer for 24 years. So I bring with me some experience of two of those sectors, and the programme that I want to speak to you about today, the Culture and Crisis Programme at the Victoria and Albert Museum, tries very hard to connect with that third sector, the humanitarian sector. So by way of brief introduction, the Victoria and Albert Museum sits in the heart of London, 2.5 million objects, 7 miles of public display space, and been there for about 170 years. And we have collections from all over the world, and that's an important element, an important feature for us. I'm going to talk to you today about not security. We're in the security world, but security maybe with a big S. It's my genuine belief that museums are better protected and better secured if we not only ensure the cultural protection of our own objects, but we ensure the protection of objects from the communities and the countries that we celebrate within our own collections. I'm going to talk to you today about the Culture and Crisis Programme at the V&A. You can see there what it says. I shan't read it out, but it's because we're an organisation, as most international museums are, with collections from around the world. We don't just collect things from London. We don't just collect things from the UK. We have collections representing most of human history and from across the world. And therefore it's essential for us to be in a position where we can demonstrate that we care passionately for those objects and for those communities from where those objects come from. So the Culture and Crisis Programme started in 2015, and this, as has been mentioned this morning, was a time when ISIS were wreaking havoc in Iraq and in Syria. And there was something about that time that made cultural institutions and museums realise that something was different. Our former director, Professor Dr. Martin Rort, said at the time some words that confused me, if I'm honest, but he said, "Everything is the same, but everything is different." And it took me a while to work out what he meant. What he meant was that cultural destruction is nothing new. Everything is the same. It's always happened. I won't say it always will, but it's always happened and it always has. But everything is different. Why is it different? It was a realisation of museums that they can no longer sit there and do nothing. They can no longer say this is a problem that's far away, but that it's a problem connected to us as museums because we collect and we own and we value the objects from those places. And therefore, his belief and my belief is that museums needed to stand up and find a way that they could contribute to this international problem of cultural heritage destruction. At the end of that conference, there was something signed. As many conferences, we signed declarations and statements. We signed the London Declaration. Lots of museums from around the world, politicians, NGOs, and great cultural institutions signed this declaration declaring that they could do more. I'm disappointed now because 8 years on, there's a lot of great individual acts. There's a lot of great individuals doing things within organisations and within museums and institutions, but there are not many great institutions, and I certainly don't include the V&A as one either. We do the minimum that we need to do. There is still, in my opinion, an apathy around museums about getting involved within this area. And there's really no excuse for that, especially when we consider, even since then, that Syria, Yemen, Ukraine, Gaza, there's just no real reason that this has not been brought to the fore and why museums are not doing more. And on that count, I wanted to really applaud the organisers of this conference, the National Museum here, for doing its bit, for finding a place and a forum to make a discussion, to build a network, to bring people together, which is exactly what the Culture in Crisis programme at the V&A has sought to do. My message today really is that conferences, declarations and statements will not protect us from a cultural crisis any more than they will protect us from a climate crisis. It's time for us to stand up and act. It's time for this generation to do something about this tangibly, to bring forward change that will protect our future for future generations. And I want to demonstrate today by showing you the Culture in Crisis programme and how it works with the other areas of the Victoria and Albert Museum, the very easy solution, maybe cheap, and the minimum that institutions should maybe be doing. Up there. So, quite often museums, in my opinion, back out of doing things because of a fear. A fear of what? A fear of their past, their colonial history, their background, their collecting history. Many of us, and I include the V&A very openly in this, have collected and acquired things that now we are embarrassed about, that we don't necessarily want in our collections, things that we wouldn't acquire now that seemed quite right in the 1980s, the 1970s or the 1930s. How can we go about making a change to that? How can we argue for cultural protection whilst at the same time having things within our collection that might bring controversy to that argument? Well, one thing is to create a programme like ours which has got a slightly separate brand identity to the museum. And we've done that very deliberately. The Culture in Crisis programme is the V&A. It is owned by the V&A. It is enshrined within V&A legislation and practice. But to the public, it doesn't necessarily appear to be V&A. You saw the big V&A brand at the beginning. You see the Culture in Crisis logo. We have our own logo, our own website, our own social media pages. They're all backed up and supported by the V&A, but then deliberately designed to be slightly different, to provide a little bit of distance and operating space for us. But we can't do this without the support of the whole V&A. It's transparently our programme, and therefore the V&A must be involved in it as well. So how might we do that? Well, the V&A to be involved has to have policies and procedures. It has to have practices that support cultural protection. It means we have to have open dialogue with communities. We have to repatriate objects when it's possible to do so. We have to have renewable cultural partnerships, focused curating, and most importantly, admitting and discussing the errors of our past and the barriers to change, but also not accepting those barriers, not hiding behind them, but challenging them wherever it's possible. So I've got a few examples now. One, because at some of these conferences you never get pretty pictures. So from a museum, I wanted to bring some objects to you, not just pictures of destruction, Peter, which is very often displayed. So I've brought some objects, but also objects which have been subject to looting, etc., as is the case here. This object, which was in the V&A's collection since 1933, was found originally by a British Army officer. Very often a story that's a very common story with objects in museums, found by a British Army officer at the time as part of a Roman sarcophagus coming from Turkey. By the time he came back to England, somehow the head had become detached from the sarcophagus. No one knows that, there's no record of that, but the sarcophagus ends up within the Istanbul Museum, whilst the head ends up back with the family house in the UK and in London. This is quite a simple case. The fact that we make these objects accessible online now, our openness, allowed a potential match to be made. The V&A was able to make a plaster cast of it, which was sent over to the museum. It was a fit, it was a match, and therefore there was a request that it be returned. This was a simple case of repatriation. There was no argument with this. It had been taken, it should be returned. Sometimes there are legal barriers in the way of this, but in this case, the person who bequeathed it to the V&A had said, I would love this to be returned to the original object if the original object is ever found. And so that gave us an opportunity to return that object. So repatriation is one of the things that museums need to do in order to ensure that you can have a successful program of cultural protection. Another is here, this golden ewer. This is actually from the Gilbert Trust for Arts, which is housed within the V&A. They employ a provenance researcher, an essential element for any museum, in my opinion. Works at the Victoria and Albert Museum, looking at ours, but funded by them. This object is 4,500-year-old solid gold object from Ankara. Was within their collection, unprovenanced. The researcher effectively found out that it had been looted, or most likely to have been looted, because they're a private institution, they're not governed by the legislation in the UK, such as the National Heritage Act, and therefore they're able to return it. Why do I show this for you? A very simple case here. It's stolen, they've given it back. It's because of the object that you see on the right-hand side. It's because of the thought behind this. They created, or they asked an artist called Adi Tok to create an object that reflected that item within their history, to not replace the object, but to tell the story of that object that has now been returned. In other words, not dismissing that history, but embracing that history. The history of an object that shouldn't have been on display in the V&A isn't on display in the V&A, but this object reflects it and reimagines it by a modern artist, reminds us of the mistakes of the past and how we should deal with objects in the future. Sometimes legislation does get in the way. These objects from Magdala were very clearly looted by British forces, but they're subject to the National Heritage Act. They were given to us many years ago. We are unable to give them back. The V&A is leading the way in what we call renewable cultural partnerships, working with the communities. If we are stuck by legislation, what else can we do? How else can we display things, contextualise them, and curate them in a way that makes that more acceptable to the community from which they've been taken? These are on display still at the Victoria and Albert Museum, but in a museum, in a way that has been curated with the owners and the community that's involved. In the essence of time, I'm going to skip over that object and this one. These are other objects which just demonstrate how the V&A has been doing this, but I can see I'm running out of time. And I want to speak about the Culture and Crisis Programme. So what do we do at the Victoria and Albert Museum as a programme? The Culture and Crisis Programme was designed to bring people together. Why did we choose to do that? Because we felt as a museum in London, that was what we could do. We also saw that other museums and cultural institutions were doing other things. Some were involved in the first aid of heritage sites. Some were supplying equipment and training and capacity building. We didn't want to replicate what others were doing. We wanted to do something that supported the global effort and played to our best skills, and that's where the Culture and Crisis Programme came in. Over the years, we've built up an enormous network, very much based on Professor Stone's idea of the three sectors. We try to bring together wherever we can the military, the police, customs, but we also bring together the heritage sector in all of its different guises and the humanitarian sector, and broader, further afield, bringing in the media and others as well. The network we've built over the years through a series of public programming, through conferences, etc. It now extends to more than 7,500 people and extends across the globe. I can't see what's going up. Was that? I've got two here, and I don't know which one's up there. So, which one do we have? Yeah, you've seen that. Right. So our public programme, which was brought together largely by my colleague, Laura Searson, who's just had a baby and gone on leave, so she's been replaced. But she brought an element where I very much came from a sort of police background. My background was in the illicit trafficking of cultural goods. She comes from a museum background, a cultural background, and a working with communities background. And she's created an amazing public programme. The concept of this from the beginning was everything is free. Everything is free, everything is open, and everything is accessible to everyone. We won't do anything if there's any barrier to involvement. We will not be involved in any sort of charging. So everything we do, we try to make as accessible to everyone, and we then try and put it on our websites to ensure that people in the future can benefit from it, can come together and learn from each other. So there's a series of podcasts on there, or audio recordings as they're known. A lot of our lectures are there either transcribed or recorded. We also, even during the pandemic, we carried on working. The bottom one should, oh gosh, I'm lost now, where am I? There we go, oh, it is working. So this works again with sort of tri-party of organisations, even during the pandemic, ensuring that we could carry on the conversations. Actually, it proved to be a really game-changing event for us. The pandemic brought younger people in. When you fly people to a conference around the world, it tends to be people about my age who turn up. It's the directors and the heads of department that turn up to conferences. And if you're lucky, some of the students are sitting at the back. When you go online, they can actively be engaged within the conversation. They can ask questions, they can challenge things. To try and further that, we actually introduced the idea of a youth moderator during these conferences. And that meant that rather than having someone my age moderating the discussion and steering it in the way we wanted it to go, we had someone from university, usually an undergraduate, who was involved in steering that, so that the conversation could be more attuned to their thinking. International conferences, you can see the list we've had there. We've done a lot of work working with people in wildlife, heritage, biodiversity, conservation. The One Health approach is essential to cultural protection. That you can't do it without people, community and space. And the heritage that sits within there absolutely requires the plan to involve all of those elements. And then a little bit more bringing it back to home. Some of my colleagues here, this was a conference we held a while ago where we started to explore how we as cultural institutions could protect ourselves from the unthinkable. Was the first conference, war. And then it became not so unthinkable at all, but actually we had a legal obligation to prepare for war. And so we've started to have a series of conferences and discussions around this subject. This very hard subject for people to deal with. The V&A had not planned for war since 1939, was the last time we had a formal plan of how to evacuate objects. It incidentally took us a year and a day to evacuate the objects we needed to do. When we're talking about modern warfare, we probably won't get a year and a day to prepare. So we have to think very, very differently to how we might do that. We're getting involved with our partners. So these partners that we put at the beginning, we also work with them. We deliver things with ICOM, we deliver things through the OSCE and various other organisations to ensure that we get best practice. There's no point in trying to do things alone. We do it with a whole plethora of different partners. We are now doing a little bit more capacity building, taking some of the learning that we've had and transferring it abroad. And we'll skip through these. And lastly, very quickly, and I'll run out of time, so I apologise, the Culture in Crisis portal is the physical, digital manifestation of our networking. It was designed to bring projects together in a digital format. It's the largest online database of heritage protection projects. It's a fascinating read. If you want to go in there, you can find anything on there, very easy to use, completely free, completely accessible to everyone. You don't pay to list, you don't pay to search. We want students, journalists, etc., to use this as a research tool, as well as for organisations to use it to work out the best way that they can work with others. There's a quick review of where we are with that. There's a QR code for modern people, young people. You can snap that and it takes you straight to the website, apparently. That's the Culture in Crisis portal where you find all of our lectures, conferences, etc. And there's the portal where you can go straight on. You can use it now on your phone and download it. We've also got our own social media on X, as it is now, on our own channel, Culture in Crisis, so please follow us there. I've rushed through, and I'm sorry, I'm still over a minute late, and I apologise most sincerely, but thank you very much for your attention.